Always do it on my own, so I gotta get through it. And the only thing I know is to love what I'm doing. Never give up, never slow, till I finally prove it. Never listen to the no's, I just wanna keep moving. Keep my head up when I act, head up, that's a fact. Never looking back, I'ma keep myself on track. Keep my head up, staying strong, always moving on. Feel I don't belong, tell my thoughts to move along. Push myself to be the best, die with no regrets. Live with every breath, see my message start to spread. And I had so many dreams, then you hit your teens. Life ain't really what it seems, try to find out what it means. Always do it on my own, so I gotta get through it. And the only thing I know is to love what I'm doing. Never give up, never slow, till I finally prove it. Never listen to the no's, I just wanna keep moving. Yeah, I put out all this art, it's my only medicine. Yeah, everything I do, I'm just being genuine. Yeah, I'm sick of being screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah. I'm grateful, oh yeah, able, oh yeah, I'm stable, oh yeah, no label, oh yeah, you know me, I have only a path, I'm lonely, but damn, I'm going to I don't want no fake love, I want the real stuff. Everybody listen up, cause I'll only say it once. I'm gonna show you all the path, if you want it bad. I'm gonna show you where it's at, yeah, how you can get it back. Yeah, cause I ain't never done, I'll be number one. Working hella hard until I get just what I want, yeah. Rises like the sun, yeah, fatal like a gun. Shooters gonna shoot and I'm gonna shoot until I won, yeah. Always do it on my own, so I gotta get through it. And the only thing I know is to love what I'm doing. Never give up, never slow, till I finally prove it. Never listen to the no's, I just wanna keep moving. Yeah, I put out all this art, it's my only medicine. Yeah, everything I do, I'm just being genuine. Yeah, I'm sick of being screwed, feel my own adrenaline.
How's everyone doing?
I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
All right. So I'm trying the earbud thing. If for some reason the sound isn't coming over or you can't hear my screen, let me know and I'll switch back to the giant headset. But I am tired of it destroying what little hairline I have left. All right. So today we are doing part 2 of my hypothetical debate between Gavin Ortlund and Dan McCullen. Before we get into it, I do want to give a correction. So I messed up yesterday. In my conversation, I'd mess up on the point. I want to be very clear. The point was solid, but the evidence that I used was incorrect. I was going based off of useful charts, and useful charts. I guess he took down the video, and the article that he based it on is also no longer available. So instead, to make the point of someone who is real, but whose ancestry may be fictional, that is, as in his direct ancestry might not have really existed. It could have been someone else. We are going to look at 2 individuals here, and we are looking at the great academic resource that is Wikipedia. We have Ahab and we have Azaz. From 874, 853, and 732 and 716. Okay? So we have historical records for these 2 people. And there are like 2 or 3 videos from Useful Charts that do back this up. There's also other articles. None of them were high academic articles. The one that I was basing it on was a very academic heavy article. And like I said, it's also gone. So from what I could tell, maybe the evidence for that claim for the particular person that was named a few years after the article was published had turned out to be forged. So that person is no longer on this list. So instead we have Ahab and Azaz as the 2 real people whose direct ancestor may or may not have been a real person. But the one that's on record is the one that we have versus whoever their real parents were. So that's all that there is to it. And there's no evidence for the people who, for his grandparents or for parents. That doesn't mean they didn't exist. It just means it might not be the names who we think they are. But we know this guy existed. All right. So now that I've done that and I've apologized for my mistake, let's get into this. All right.
Sure thing. Today we're going to be talking with Professor David M. Carr, who is professor of Hebrew Bible at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and also teaches classes at Jewish Theological Seminary, also in New York. Welcome to the show, David. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, it's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're glad we could have you. Have been working with your stuff for a while now. I wrote a dissertation at Exeter University that was mainly focused on Hebrew Bible, and really enjoyed some of the stuff that you've written.
I want to be very clear. I have no idea who this guy is. I don't even know who this. Okay, I don't know who he is. I don't know who he is. I kind of know who he is.
Particularly the formation of the Hebrew Bible, writing on the tablet of the heart, reading the fractures of Genesis was, I think, the first work of yours that I came across, which I think you published almost 30 years ago. And then today we're going to be democratizing to some degree.
Look, if you're not a nameless, faceless person under the title of something innocuous, how would I know you even exist? Okay, you're not useful charts, you're not logic, you're not godless cranium, you're not atheism is unstoppable. How am I supposed to recognize you if you have a human name and a human face?
Your work in both a commentary on Genesis 1 through 11 and your book, The Formation of Genesis 1 through 11, Biblical and Other Precursors. Does that sound right? Did we get the brief correct there?
That was fantastic.
Okay. I wonder if you might just to begin, introduce yourself a bit, let our audience know who you are.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that intro. My name is Ramon. I have an associate's in philosophy. I have been doing religious studies here on YouTube for at least 7 years, and I've been on YouTube for 11 years total. I started off as a martial arts channel. I'm really glad you asked this question. Let's see. I've read the Bible multiple times, so, there's that. I've also read the Church Fathers, and I've been practicing the Liturgy of the Hours. I'm also Catholic. I'm a Cancer, if you need to know that. I work out every day, and I really like pizza, but because I'm diabetic, I can't eat it anymore. So I have to be okay with like pork rinds and stuff. I also used to be a vegetarian and a vegan at some point, but that didn't really last. That's really not related to the topic at hand, but I just thought I'd want you to know that.
Yeah, well, as you did a great job of introducing where I am right now at Union Theological Seminary in New York. I taught for 12 years at a little seminary in Ohio before that. So I've been at this Hebrew Bible thing for a good while. And I'm amazed that I still find it fascinating. I can be an eternal student. I just attach Bible to some other topic and it's legit. Which is a lot of fun. I have to say, I feel like over my career, I've done a lot better job speaking to doctoral students and fellow colleagues with my work. And I've tried at various points to write to a broader audience, and to some extent have reached folks. But it feels like somewhat like somebody with a rifle who's aiming at a target and always hits above it. That's true of me. So I'm so happy to have this chance to talk with you all and have you bring me into contact with your amazing audience.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you. We're excited to.
And I want to say, I know I made a joke earlier, but I want to say that I do appreciate that, because one of my complaints, and I've said this in a few of my live streams, is that the academic level information it doesn't trickle down, and there's a barrier of access. Both financial and communal. So I do appreciate and not joking around at all, I do appreciate Dan McKellen putting someone like this available for the masses and not putting it behind a paywall. So thank you, Dan. That's cool.
To get to it, I will admit that I have not. Look, your books are apparent. Dan has said how amazing they are. I have not been able to access it. I didn't get a copy of your book before the thing. So I'm a babe in the woods. I apologize. I wish I had been able to dive in beforehand, but something tells me I wouldn't get it. Something tells me that I don't have the necessary background. So I'm going to be here filling in for our listeners, asking dumb questions, and I think we'll be able to make it through together.
Sounds great.
As Bill Murray.
I'm going to be just up front. I have already pre-watched this. I was watching it while I was hanging out in the front of the house with the brand new kitten. There's only one kitten left, and I'm trying to adopt it as my own. I don't think it's going to happen. But unlike Gavin's, which was frustrating, this one's pretty straightforward, and it's really good. It has a lot of good information. I will still be commenting, obviously, but this one is a lot less frou-frou, a lot less flourish, and a lot more substantive. So very awesome.
Murray says in my wife's favorite movie, What About Bob? Baby steps. So
I think that's a good way to start. That's a good way to go about this.
We're going to start with defining what we're talking about. Genesis 1 through 11, also known as the primeval history. Why do we have our own title for these 11 chapters? Where is this coming from, and what sets it off from the rest of the book of Genesis?
Well, these chapters are the part of Genesis that really talk about general human origins. The people of Israel don't yet appear anywhere in these chapters. Abraham will be called by God at the beginning of chapter 12, right after these chapters. And that starts the story of the promise to him and his descendants, and the gradual formation of the people of Israel out of his grandkids. So that story is going to start in Genesis 12. But Genesis 1 to 11 are these stories of ancient primeval origins, of creation, of flood, of various emergent aspects of human civilization, of the great cities of Mesopotamia. Basically, the writers of Genesis are telling about their setting before they're going to get to the big story of how they came to be as a people.
Yeah, I think a lot of our even listeners who haven't read the book cover to cover would know a lot of the sort of stories of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, because they're iconic. We're talking Adam and Eve, we're talking Noah and the flood, we're talking the Tower of Babel, we're talking, or Babel, or whatever you call it. These are pretty, every children's Bible storybook has.
And that is very true. I've read these as a kid. There was that really cool clay stop motion series animation that was awesome, that did all the Bible stories, and it was actually a time travel that went back in time. It was weird. A time travel went back in time and would relive the Bible stories. And I think the very end episode is that the time travel was actually God, and he was personally interacting with the kids. It was a weird kids cartoon, but it was cool, and it was graphic too. Like, ooh. And then the children's Bibles that I read as a kid all had these stories in them. But again, the version in the Bible is much more adult than the version you get in these children's Bibles. If anyone remembers the clay animation, the stop motion clay animation about the two kids that travel back in time and get to witness all the biblical events, and at the end they find out that the guy, or it hints at or implies that the guy who helped them time travel, for some reason he looked in my memory like Mark Twain, but at the end he ends up being God, or implied that he's God. Yeah, if you remember that one, let me know.
All of these stories in it, and then there are entire books of the Bible that aren't touched in the children's books. So there's something special about these stories in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. And for the various people who tried to read the Bible from beginning to end, usually they make it through the first 11 chapters. They're going to cut out sometime maybe later on, but they'll make it through this primeval history.
Yeah.
The narrative slows to a crawl as soon as we get past those.
Although I got to say,
I could always force myself to get through the begots, but it was the numbers that normally would kill me in my attempts to read through the entire Bible before I actually did it for the first time.
chapters 5 and 10, when you start to get into who begat whom, that can be pretty thick. That can be
fair enough.
Now, you mentioned this is where the writers are kind of establishing their setting, and I think a lot of people assume one of two things: either that these chapters come down from hoary antiquity, somewhere in the obscure past, are incredibly ancient texts, or they adopt the tradition that Moses received the whole Pentateuch by revelation, and so that's kind of the.
And I know the guy got upset and jumped out of my channel before I had a chance to respond, but Wesley, the guy's name was Wesley, he was affirming, I guess, that it was by revelation that God personally told these stories to Moses, and Moses then tells them or relates them to us and puts them in writing, yada, yada, yada. I understand that that's some people's point of view, and other people will view it as that either the Metatron or Jesus told Moses. I get that. I'm not trying to dog on you when I was saying what I was saying yesterday. I was not arguing against your particular belief system. I was arguing against Gavin's half measure of trying to pull people over to the spiritual and allegorical understanding of Genesis. I think he should have just gone all the way and gone and claimed it to be polemic. I really do think he should have. And I do think a half measure like what he did is just going to cause more confusion, because now you're not satisfying any criteria.
The temporal setting is the time of Moses, but for scholars, that's not likely when these texts came together. If you had to, we'll talk a little bit.
If at any point you can't hear me talk, please let me know if I'm muted.
More about the details as we get deeper into the interview. But if you had to kind of lay our scene a little bit, where are we talking in time for these stories coming together?
Amazing helped Anthony through night classes.
Okay, so the commercial is a perfect time for me to talk. So I've always, and I mean, I'm talking going back well over 11 years, maybe even 15 years ago. I've always thought that most of this stuff was written either on their way back from the Babylonian exile or post-Babylonian exile when they were reestablishing themselves in Jerusalem. I think very few of these records would be from the people who stayed in Jerusalem, although I would assume they would also have a source of writing or a source of tradition. So the remnant gets kind of washed over by the returns. So, yeah. Let's see what he says.
We can think about authors who are literate scribes. They're the scholars of their community in a tiny community in what we now call Israel, Palestine, in the sort of eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And they are writing about, give or take, 2,600 years ago. And they're working within what in their setting is just a really pretty tiny kingdom. It's only a little bit bigger than the greater New York area where I live. And they have all around them major civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, also large Syrian cities and stuff. Those are the sort of big kingdoms that they have to contend with. And they're small scale farmers or village dwellers. There's some a little bit larger towns, and that's probably where these scholars worked. But they're living in this kind of context, and they're having to contend with everyday life, which can be really hard in those contexts, and sometimes massive catastrophes. In many ways, I think the story of the formation of the Bible is the story of various texts being written in the furnace of communal trauma. And
So, that is literally, if you've watched my channel for the last 5 years, is what I've been preaching. I can't tell you where I picked that opinion up from. I really don't remember. It could have been in one of the Oxford Study Bibles. It could have been in the Catholic Study Bible. I'm unsure, but I know I picked that up somewhere. I know that it was in commentary. It wasn't like the idea just came. It's not like I did. I did cobble together that idea from several commentaries that were all incomplete on their idea there. And it was also influenced by my, I did a world philosophy course that was like development of philosophy or something like that. And I did a sociology course. And both of these had to do with development of ideas and how they develop out of conflict and how fire was really important to the gathering of people and the cooking of food was important to the development of the mind. Again, this was a philosophy course. And through these little pieces that I came up to the same conclusion that he's saying. So if you've been on my channel for any amount of time, this should not be shocking to you. This shouldn't bother you. For the new people that are coming in, I know there's a lot of new subscribers coming in from my reviews on the James White debates. Speaking of which, prayer for James White. I hope he gets better. I know he's sick right now, but I heard it was non-life-threatening, so he should be good. But he's in the hospital, so pray for him. But yeah, so if you watch my channel and you've been here for a while, this shouldn't be shocking at all. This is pretty much stuff that we've talked about many times over and over again here.
And it's not just one; it's a bunch of them, one after the other, as these little tiny kingdoms are buffeted by major empires who have an interest in their area. And so that's a very different way, I realize, of setting the Bible, setting it in the context of a group of people confronting the difficulties of everyday life and of collective trauma. But for me, getting insights into the way the Bible was forged in that kind of context really adds a whole different level of meaning to me. It helps me understand why the Bible became the text that we're still talking about today, like on this podcast, when a lot of the texts of these major empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia were lost in the sands when the kingdoms were destroyed. There's some kind of resilience in these texts that was forged in trauma. And I think people nowadays and across the centuries can hear that deeper music in them.
And I think it's reflecting some of the universal experiences of humanity. You mentioned the trauma, the fact that they have persevered, and a part of that is the fact that the groups of people who have curated those texts have managed to persevere in the face of so much persecution, so much trauma. 2,500, 2,600 years ago, we're talking just before and after the Babylonian exile, which seems to be one of the largest traumatic scars that is left on the surface of the Hebrew Bible. Would you say that these texts...
And again, that fits with my theories and understanding as far as I know. I know I said that earlier, but I didn't say that because of this video. I truly do believe that's when this is taking place and what that has to do with. I know there are even friends of mine who follow this channel who are upset with me for holding that opinion, but everything that I've read, and not just religious stuff or religious commentary, I know that people have told me to be wary of listening to these kind of people and reading the books that I read that'll hurt my spirituality and stuff like that. I'm not concerned with that. The facts are fine. And this is stuff that I've held of opinion on for over 15 years. And what they're saying is what I understand.
Begin their formation prior to the exile and kind of take the shape that we know them now after returning from the exile? Is it a little hard to tell, or is it something where we can say, oh, this is definitely before, this is definitely after?
It's so rare in biblical scholarship that you can say anything is definite, I have to say. I will say this, for what it's worth, as an orientation point. One of the things that scholars started to recognize.
And for those of you that are Catholic, I do recommend reading, I believe it's John Paul II's writing on this, and I also know Pope Benedict wrote on this as well. And he, both of these great thinkers, great Catholic theologians, come to the same conclusions that these men, at least up to, I'm going to say around this point, at least up to the 30-minute mark, to the same conclusions that they're saying. So if you're Catholic and you're worried about this material, this is not concurrent, not sanctified. What's the right word? This does not go against the current Catholic theories, so don't even worry about that.
Already over 300 years ago, is that these chapters in Genesis, and actually much of the rest of the Torah, are formed really out of two probably originally separate written strands. Mm-hmm. And scholars often refer, I know you know this already, but just to mention it for anybody in the audience who doesn't, one of those strands is referred to by scholars as the priestly strand. Not that there are any priests in the primeval history, really, but that's what they call it, the priestly strand, or P for short. And then the others, and it starts with the 7-day creation account in Genesis 1, and then it includes those genealogies that bog people down often in Genesis 5 and 10 that you were mentioning, Dan, and then it also includes other crucial parts of the flood narrative and that sort of thing. That's one strand that originally existed separately, and then there's what scholars used to refer to, and many still do, as the J strand, the Yahwistic strand. I tend to prefer a more neutral term for complicated reasons of non-P, non-priestly strand, which starts with the Garden of Eden story in Genesis 2-3 and the Cain and Abel story. I mean, amazing stories, narrative stories that have a very different feel to them than the 7-day creation account or whatever. And then it continues with its own flood strand and onto the a story of Noah and his sons and the Tower of Babel story. Anyway, this J strand or non-P strand, you'll hear me use the term non-P more here, it has its own separate character to it. And most scholars over the last few hundred years have thought it was an originally separate strand. And back to your question, Dan, I am still of the opinion, and I'm probably in the majority in North America, but in the minority vis-a-vis some of my European colleagues. I think the non-P strand is a pre-P strand and probably pre-exilic. So,
I think this is a good time to bring up a slightly related topic, which is, as you know, I listen to Bart Ehrman's podcast a lot, and Dan Bowen's wife said something today that it's probably the first time I've ever, probably the first time I've disagreed with her on anything she said on any of these shows, where it would be unethical. And I've heard Dr. Bowen say the same thing when he's talking about the New Testament. It would be unethical for Bart or anyone or herself to speculate on the Quran or anything else because they're not an expert on it. I don't hold that opinion at all. If you are able to read a book and you read it and you think you understood it, or even if you didn't understand it and you want to ask questions about it, that's what YouTube is here for. That's what the freedom of speech is for. You can express your opinion. Feel free to get egg on your face. Feel free to make a fool of yourself. Do not let the fact that you don't have a piece of paper prevent you from sharing your ideas. There's plenty of billionaires and millionaires in the world who don't have a college education. Don't let the fact that you don't have a college education stop you from pursuing your passion or what or what you know. That doesn't mean that you're not going to be wrong. That's not going to mean that you don't make mistakes. I believe I just watched a video with What Do You Mean, talking about how even his views have changed theologically in the last few years. So yeah, we're constantly revolving, we're constantly evolving, we're constantly learning, and we're going to learn more. And we're going to have access to more information because those high walls, those high ivory walls are coming down. Between Jordan Peterson trying to get an accredited online university, a real accredited, not like the BS stuff that you get the advertisements for, going at a high level of education, I think that's awesome, and I think that's coming. So I do think we're going to have better information. We're going to be able to get degrees and stuff like that online completely without having to attend or even matriculate into the old school Ivy League universities. That's not going to be a thing 100 years from now. I really don't think so. So if you want to learn something, go learn it. If you want to talk about it and ask questions about it, do it. Don't worry about, don't feel bad that you don't have the best understanding. Don't let that limit you from sharing your thoughts. Just understand you got to be open to correction. Whenever I make a mistake, I got to admit that I made a mistake. I have to go back and learn something new. I have to go buy a new book. I have to wait until I can afford a book to go buy it, all that kind of stuff. So just don't let the fact that you're not an expert prevent you from pursuing what you want to learn about. Anyway, that's my little soapbox. Let's keep going.
So it was formed in the time. There's still a lot of trauma going on, but that big one hasn't happened yet. And whereas the priestly strand almost certainly was formed in the wake of the Babylonian exile and destruction of Jerusalem and that kind of thing. And you can see that subtly reflected in different aspects of that material.
Yeah, we had Leanne Feldman on a bit ago to talk about her book, The Consuming Fire. So we have a little bit of an orientation to P. I believe she's a little closer to Joel Baden and the neo-documentary hypothesis than I am, and perhaps than you are. But you mentioned the 7-day creation account that we find in Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 2, 3, or 4a, and then we have the other one running from the second half of Genesis 2:4 down through the rest of the Adam and Eve story. I'd love to hear. I bring up the fact that these are two different, originally independent creation accounts quite frequently on social media, and the picture that I have tried to paint is of an earlier account where there are concerns with the way God is represented. There are concerns with the way the creative act is represented, where we have the priestly group coming in and trying to.
And again, for the Catholics out there who are watching this, who are coming from the videos where I'm critiquing James White, and I do see you guys out there. I see the likes. I see the comments you're giving me. I do greatly appreciate that. Just know that what Dan McCullen is saying right now is not controversial in the Catholic Church. These are the opinions of many Catholic theologians. There are, the earlier and the later writings, there are two separate writings, two separate takes, two separate understandings. The idea of there being different sources and them being compiled, none of this is controversial. Yes, there are radical traditionalists that will tell you have to take this literally. Yes, there are radical traditionalists that will say that the academia is completely false. Look at what it's done to the Jewish community, that kind of stuff. I get it. Don't listen to them. The radical traditionalists are not your friends here. Listen to Dan. You don't have to like what he says. You don't have to agree with what he says. But listen to what the experts are saying. And then try to read the Bible with what they're saying in mind. It's worth listening to, even if you disagree with them. That doesn't mean that they're right. It just means that their opinions are not as inflammatory and controversial as sometimes their delivery makes it seem that they are.
Massage it into something that's a little more comfortable. Could you talk about your thoughts on the relationship?
Hi, remember when I said to tell me if I'm muted? Yeah, I was muted. I just gave like a whole monologue and no one could hear me. Short version of what I just said. Everything that Dan right now is saying is consistent with what most Catholic theologians teach. Don't be scared off by the rad trads who are going to tell you not to listen to Dan McCullen or any of these people. Most of this stuff that what they're saying is stuff that Catholic theologians say, that Catholic scholars say. Yes, obviously when they get to the more secular, more atheistic, anti-theistic conclusions, obviously we're not going to agree there. But on the facts of the Bible itself, we're going to agree. So don't be scared off by this information. This is good stuff.
Relationship of these two creation accounts?
Sure. Yeah, it's a fascinating example, I think, of writing and counter-writing, where the two texts are
I'm kind of sniffly, so I'm going to mute it one more time, and I'm going to put some nasal spray, and then I'll come back on, and I'm just going to leave the mic on, so hopefully I will stop sniffling, and it won't ruin the audio.
originally set up in opposition to each other before they're then brought into the same strand. But the Garden of Eden story, this is a story that I've been reading it for decades as a full-time professional scholar, and I still see new things in it every time. But it's this incredible story about how God sort of initially creates these childlike humans in a garden, tells them, you can have all these yummy trees, anything you want, except for this one tree in the middle of the garden. And anybody who has kids knows if you want to guarantee that somebody's going to eat from something, you just do that. Just tell them that they can do anything. And so and it says if you don't do it, if you eat from this tree, you will definitely die. You will surely die. And
so I want to talk about two things there. The first one is, so I read through. So when I say that I've read the Bible 7 times, only one of those times was a Bible without commentary. All the rest of them were study Bibles. And so I really felt after the 7th time that I read through these, and after the 6th time I read through a study Bible, that there was nothing new to surprise me when it comes to Genesis and Revelation and all these other books. Then I started reading the Church Fathers' commentaries, and it just opened up a whole new world. Reading John Christensen, reading Origen. There was a third one. I don't think it was Augustine, but there was a third one that was just revolutionary and just revelatory. There's way more there than you think there is. So even if you're someone who's very well studied and knows a lot of this stuff, there's a lot of depth in these stories. Even if you've listened to Jordan Peterson's take on it 100 times, like there's more there.
And there's this whole dialogue. I won't go deeply into the story, but the woman eventually realizes, hey, wait a minute, thanks to the snake, I realized this tree will give me some good wisdom. I'll become like.
Oh, and on the death thing, I would say becoming mortal would be they died on that day. And also they died to God in that way, which for Catholics, we take it as a sign of mortal sin. So they committed a mortal sin, so they're dead. They're spiritually dead to God on that day when they ate it.
God knowing good and evil, and she and her man eat from it, and the snake is right. Their eyes are open, they get wisdom. But God then says, oh, this is not good. They have godlike knowledge. What if they also eat of the tree of eternal life and gain immortality? I've got to send them out of the garden. And does so. And as a result of that, the humans will definitely die, just as God had predicted. It wasn't that God was going to put them to death. It's just that they will gain mortality because God can't tolerate having them in the garden if they've eaten.
And again, from a Catholic perspective, this is just an example of mortal sin. So when you commit a mortal sin and you die to God, you're not physically dying in real life. So when you commit a crime that's, hurting another person, that's against the 10 Commandments or that's against the dictates of Christ, and it's unchristian, and you're defying God, you don't physically die in real life. You're spiritually dead, meaning that you're going to go to hell or whatever, Sheol, whatever you want to say. So just realize that's how we're constructing this understanding if you're a Catholic or a Christian. And for the Christians that don't believe in mortal sin, it's still talking about them being spiritually dead, not physically dead. It doesn't mean that God quits loving them or quits caring about them, by the way. I know you all have problems with anathemas as well.
The tree of knowledge. What's interesting, back to your question, Dan, about this story, is it's positing a God who's worried about humans becoming too godlike. And, God is kind of remarkably human in this story. He's walking in the garden, jealous, kind of duplicitous with regard to the humans. There's a lot going on there. I like this picture of God myself. But
and the anthropomorphic qualities of God in the earlier parts of the Bible really becomes problematic when you get to Psalms and when you get to later parts of the Bible. And then when you get to the New Testament, especially in the letters, the epistles, you get a very different picture of God. And we call that progressive revelation. We say that it's development of understanding. But just understand that if you're not looking at it from an inspired point of view, if you don't think it's one author, these are completely different takes and completely different understandings on the character of God and the the description of God. You have a God who hardens hearts versus a God who doesn't lie. You have a God who physically walks, and can be seen, and to a God that's invisible and cannot be seen. A God who talks in a loud, booming voice versus a God who speaks in a whisper, and you can't even hear him. So just understand that even within Genesis, this development is happening. Hold on, I got some comments. We're doing something new here today. So Deconverted Man asked 2 questions. He says, I'm going to add the word did. Did God once have a body but lost it? Nope, the understanding of God changed. And then it says, oh, you have to have an inspired point of view. How do you achieve that? You have to be, very simply, you have to be chosen by God, and then you have to be baptized. That's it. That's all you need. And then the Holy Spirit will guide you from there. And it has to be a valid baptism, by the way. Speaking in a whisper, but you can't hear it. How would you know it's speaking in a whisper? Well, I wouldn't say that God's an it, for one thing. And number 2, that's just the story of... It's not Moses. It's Moses? I think it's Moses. It could be Abraham. Is it Abraham who walks up the mountain and... No, it's Moses, where God has him turn his back and he's like listening, and at first it's thunder and lightning, and it's like, that's not God, and then there's an earthquake, that's not God, and then there's a breeze, and that's not God, and then finally there's a whisper in the wind, and it's like, that's God.
But apparently the authors of the Priestley story weren't so happy with it. And so what's remarkable about the way they tell their story in Genesis 1 is they tell the story about a absolute...
Now, it's always been my understanding that the non-priestly source came first, and then the priestly source came second. For those of you who know, is that a correct assumption on my behalf, or am I misremembering that fact?
Absolutely majestic, royal-like God who says decrees, and instantly things are just magically kind of come into place. And as a crown of this entire creation, this God is not scared of having humans be godlike, but actually makes humans as God images in order to rule all living creatures in this cosmos. So it's like diametrically, but after creation, this God...
I'm going to play that again because I'm reading what's in the chat and I got distracted.
Is not scared of having humans be godlike, but actually makes humans as God images in order to rule all living creatures in this cosmos. So it's like...
and that's actually super important for orthodoxy. So right now I'm reading a book on orthodoxy. It's part of my 158 books. I forget how many. I'm down to... I've already got like 4 or 5 of them out of the way. And the book on orthodoxy was talking about this specific passage, actually, which is funny because I watched this and then I read that and I was like, hey, that's kind of cool. So when it comes to theosis and becoming one with God, is the way the Catholics would say it, we're actually becoming God. So the original plan, according to the Orthodox understanding, is that we were supposed to be one with God. We were supposed to become God, basically, to be the co-workers with Him. And then we messed that up in our first sin. They don't call it original sin. And in this scarring of our souls, in this scarring of our nature, our divine nature, technically speaking, not our human nature, our animal nature. So this is where you can see the division between 3 natures versus the division between 2 natures and other understandings. This is actually my older understanding that I used to have. And so on our higher nature has now been scarred. So we've now been lowered. And so we've died to God. And then God brings us back to life. He doesn't give up on us, but He kicks us out of Eden. And here Eden is a physical, literal place in this Orthodox understanding. And so the whole idea of theosis or holy Hezekiah is that we are meditatively, liturgically entering into heaven on earth and entering into oneness with God, and we're trying to slowly lose our animal and human nature and go into a purely divine nature, which is beautiful. And I just think that's interesting that if you look at the different strands of theology and you go back to Genesis, you can see where we end up in different liturgical and theological understandings based on what part of Genesis you take as the part that's going to influence you. So if you're taking Genesis 1, you're going to have one theology. If you're taking Genesis 2, you're going to have another theology. And whatever combinations in between, you're going to get different theologies on the nature of man, on the nature of sin, on the relationship between man and woman. All of this is coming from Genesis. So for those who want to say they can just disconnect from the Bible or throw out Genesis and it doesn't matter, you're completely wrong. This is super important stuff. Even if it was written later, even if it's not chronologically the first thing that's written, it's still important for setting up the theologies that we have today in different denominations and religions. Okay, I'm going to, Deconverted Man, since you're saying a lot of comments, I'm going to have to just pick one at a time and then come back to each one so we can keep the show going. The next one is, how do you know you are chosen by God, and by what metric do you know it is the correct baptism? So it has to be under the correct formula, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It has to be immersion of water or sprinkling, if that is the circumstance you are in. You also need a thing called chrismation. These are things that you would learn from the church fathers and from other ecumenical councils and stuff like that.
I am metrically opposed to the message of the Garden of Eden story. And there are all sorts of other subtle indicators that the person who wrote Genesis 1 had the Garden of Eden story in mind and was trying to replace it. And then the radical move was made later to turn what was supposed to be the replacement into the prologue of the Garden of Eden story, and they were put one after the other in the same strand.
And that decision.
So the way that I've always understood it, and again, I don't know if this, for this one, I don't know if it's my original opinion or if it's something that I read or cobbled together through different influences, but is that what the retractor and what the editor and compiler were doing, were kind of doing similar work together when it came to picking which different versions they were going to put together, which is, I feel like I'm quoting one of the commentaries that I read, which is that they put them all together and they let the reader decide, because they didn't want to take the chance of not including the holy version, the correct version. So instead of picking one version and saying this is official and getting it wrong, they kept all the versions and they just let it be a mess, and you have to decide, and you can piece it together however you need to, so that it can be relevant to your life and relevant to your community and relevant to your needs. So I do agree with that interpretation of what's going on here. The reason why you have multiple sources and the reason why they're all jammed together is if they fit, even though on closer inspection they don't fit as well as it seems to when you do that kind of like just brief overview, the flyover, is that the redactor and the compiler didn't want to take a chance of not including something that was necessary, so they just included everything and just let the reader decide. Let me see, what's the next one? So your next comment is, Phil Collins is cool, but I don't know why people base so much of their theory. Okay.
Do you think this is more an archival move, like let's record them on the same scroll, or do you think this was a literary move? We're going to appropriate for our own purposes the priestly account as kind of an introduction to the other one, or do you think we don't really have a way of knowing what was in their minds?
That latter statement is probably the most accurate. We don't have a way of knowing what's in their minds, but that's a typical scholarly cautious thing. I will say one of the exciting new developments in Pentateuchal study, and believe it or not, even after 300 years, we're coming up with some really exciting new stuff, I think, is becoming more aware of ways in which these two strands I was talking about earlier, the priestly strand and the earlier non-priestly strand, or maybe not always earlier in some ways, they existed separately. But I mentioned before that the community in which these were written is pretty tiny, and literacy within the ancient world of the Levant was not widespread. So
that's something that I've been pondering probably since I was 15. You keep on saying that literacy is not widespread, that the majority of people are not literate, but someone had to write these things, and someone had to be reading them. You weren't just writing for yourself. You're not just writing for the king. You wouldn't write a document saying that kings are bad if you're writing for the king. So, I mean, there's an audience that this is being written for. There are people who are reading it. The literate people are maybe arguing with each other over time. So, you have this kind of, and you see this with the church fathers, where you have an earlier writer say something, and you have a later writer write back to this dead writer arguing with them. And you have a later person pick up the strand, and now they're writing in defense of the first person. Or they're saying both people are wrong. And then it just becomes this, over time, this very long conversation, but you're talking to dead people who can't actually answer you. So I kind of feel like that has to be going on. It has to be people writing for people who can read. Why would you write for people who you can't communicate with? Like, I don't get it. You have to be. It has to be for the priestly class. It has to be for the literate class. If the literati do not exist, then who are you writing this for?
If you have a tiny kingdom with only a tiny minority of people able to read, and you have two complete accounts, of the origins of the world, people are going to know about both of them, and they're going to start to add to each one in relation to the other. And so we're starting to see evidence in these two strands that they were modified by scribes who were still transmitting them separately before they finally come to a point where they kind of go, well, why are we working these two documents separately? Let's just make them one document and have it all together. And I think that's probably the most plausible explanation for why they did it. It's sort of archival, but they're also reading these for meaning. And so, for example, when they put these, they think it.
I think he technically answered my question, but let me go back and hear it again.
It's just make them one document and have it all together. And I think that's probably the most plausible explanation for why they did it. It's sort of archival, but they're also reading these for meaning. And so, for example, when they put these two creation stories together, there was no real alternative but to put the larger, more spacious vision of the creation of the whole cosmos in Genesis 1 at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then put what was actually the earlier creation story about the Garden of Eden as a follow-up.
Yeah.
So again, I do think it was archival, and I do think it was for meaning, and I do think you get meaning by putting clashing opinions right next to each other. I have bought maybe 10 max apologetical works. They pretty much agree with what I think, and those books are worthless to me. While I've read the church fathers who disagree with each other, and it's in their disagreement and in their arguing things out that I find inspiration, and I find thought, and I find argumentation. One of my favorite philosophers to read, and also a Protestant heretic, is Kierkegaard. I love Kierkegaard. I don't agree with almost any of his takes. I don't like his opinion on women. I don't like his opinion on children. I don't like his opinion on animals. But man, can that guy write, and man, can that guy think. And it is interesting to get into his ideas, and by disagreeing with him and arguing with him and saying like, oh, wow, that is a good idea. My philosophy and theology and my understanding of God and my understanding of human nature has grown. So it's in the disagreement that you find meaning. It's in the struggle. It's in the fight. It's, the people of Israel, the people who wrestle with God. It's in the wrestling of God with God that you find deeper and deeper meaning. So I do think though it is archival, I do think that by putting contrasting views right next to each other, by putting 4 different gospel accounts with 4 different takes on Jesus, you get a much deeper meaning of who Jesus is and a much better understanding of who the person actually was, because of the differences, because of the paradoxes and the conflicts between the texts and the different takes on different things and the different order the things happen. So I think by having 2 different Genesis accounts that possibly in themselves have maybe 1 or 2 different stories that they're synthesizing, you get yourself a beautiful, deeply rich, meaningful text, as opposed to something that was beautiful and lasted for a few hundred years and then disappeared, and now people don't read, even if you spend time translating it and you make it out there available for the public. People aren't going to go read it because the depth isn't there, and you need the conflict for the depth.
And you mentioned that it presents a deity who's a little bit jealous of their deity. They've created humanity to till the ground, to do all these things. Sounds quite similar to some Mesopotamian stories that we have where, well, one, we've got, for instance, Gilgamesh, who's seeking out eternal life. He had to watch his buddy die and decompose, and he doesn't like that idea, and so he's seeking out eternal life. And there's a serpent that snatches it from him right at the end. But we've also got in Enuma Elish and other traditions from the Sumerian, the Akkadian literature, humanity being created to do the work the gods don't want to do, and they're also keeping them at arm's length. Do you see the influence of any or maybe many of these traditions on the way these authors are writing? Are they writing in response to? Are they inspired by? Are they rejecting these other traditions that are probably far more widespread in the empires around them?
Yes, I definitely think they are. And you did a really nice job of summarizing a lot of these key elements. The story of the Garden of Eden is it never exactly verbally parallels anything in the Gilgamesh epic, but it's constantly in interaction with some of its ideas. You mentioned the theme of immortality, which obviously is a big ultimate result, but also the snake and the fruit and, the lost human chance at immortality. Gilgamesh just barely, almost has that immortality and loses it. There are just all sorts of subtle ways in which that's reflected. And then the Enuma Elish epic.
And, I agree with the popes, the recent popes, that this is polemic and not just typological, not just spiritual, or there's another word. Anyway, that being said, I do think that because you're polemically fighting against all these different versions of these stories, and these are the common myths of that time, that by putting them together into one story and taking bits and pieces, you have more of that conflict. You have more of that deeper meaning, because you're not just drawing from the Hebrew experience. You're drawing from the Babylonian, Sumerian, Assyrian, all this wisdom that's in these stories that you're now countering and talking against. You're bringing up more and more meaning, like a volcano about to explode. Like it's deeply enriching, and it preserves a record, bastardized, whatever, just like with Ragnarok and all that stuff with the Vikings. Like the Norse myths, they're bastardized. We're not getting the Norse version, but we're getting a preserved version of those myths based on what the monks translated into the Elder Edda, into the Prose Edda. So I think the same thing here. Yeah, we're not getting the original Epic of Gilgamesh. We're not getting the original Hathat Hasis, but we're getting a preservation of those stories and those traditions contained within the text. And we're getting the deepest, most meaningful parts of those stories now enladen in our version. And I do think that's incredibly powerful, incredibly important, and necessary, and beautiful. One of my favorite books, I'm going all over the place. One of my favorite books of all time, the trilogy of all times, is The Daughter of Smoke and Bone. And it pulls from everything. It pulls from wrestling, from comic books, from everything. And it makes its own book, its own world out of it, from theology and from religion and from history. And it's just beautiful because it's pulling the best parts, the deepest parts, and it's putting it into its story. and it's keeping it simple. And I think that's what makes Genesis, part of what makes Genesis so powerful, is everything that it's drawing on to give you this story.
Seems to have been the background for the Genesis 1 7-day creation account, where the Enuma Elish epic is all about trying to show how the Babylonian state god, Marduk, is the end-all be-all, the supreme god over all the other gods.
Also, if Dan ever watches this, I doubt that he ever will, but if he does. So he keeps on talking about in the Garden of Eden, the snake not representing the devil. Whatever, I don't care about that. I've always felt, and maybe if I ever do get a doctorate, maybe this will be what I'll write on. I've always felt that the serpent represented Baal. I've always thought so. I've always thought that that would be the god that El would be competing against, would be Baal for adherence. So I would think that the serpent is Baal, or Tiamat, possibly. But I would think that that's what the serpent would be representing, is the hero of the Canaanite story. And so you're countering by saying, no, he's the villain here. He's the one who's tempting you to go the wrong way. He's giving you the false knowledge versus the true knowledge. Anyway, that's always been my take. I don't know if Dan's ever going to hear that, so whatever. That was more for my edification and satisfaction than anything else.
And he can create by a word and destroy by a word, and he creates the cosmos out of dividing up the sea goddess into two, and there are all sorts of interesting ways in which Genesis 1 says kind of Marduk doesn't even.
And I know that there's some translations now that the goddess is actually a god, which does change the formula a little bit. But regardless of whether Tiamat is a goddess or a god, I do think that by having our God conquer and destroy and subjugate and control these other godly powers, it is polemic. It is saying, hey, no, look, you think nature's in charge? No, God's in charge of that. You think the angels are in charge? No, God's in charge of that. No, you think the gods are in charge? No, God's in charge of them too. So I think the divinities, the powers, the nature, the laws. I always forget what the primeval sources are called in the Greek. But all of these kind of gods and powers, and I think they are supposed to be subjected to God, the one God. I do think there's a monotheistic theme there, that the other gods and goddesses are not true gods. They're minor gods. They're demigods. They're false gods. They're divinities, but not the divine.
Even begin to figure into the picture. In fact, there are no gods that figure into the picture. There's just God, capital G.
Wow, we said the same thing. I didn't know that. I didn't remember that he said that. So that's interesting.
And that's it. And so it sort of tells an Enuma Elish-like story, but now with Marduk completely obliterated and the God of Israel as the center point of the story. So I think both of these stories are constantly interacting with the literatures of these bigger empires that surrounded the scribes. And as I say in one of my books, the tablet, Writing on the Tablet of the Heart, this is scribes, ancient scholars of the time, that literate minority. They learned to write on older literature, and at least at some point, we can't reconstruct exactly how or why it appears that older literature that they were reading and actually probably memorizing were these stories of Gilgamesh or Atrahasis is another one that comes up. We might talk about that a little later.
Now, again, I'm going to ask, wouldn't this also be oral tradition as well, though? It's not just writing. I mean, we're talking about no television, like no radio. This is sharing stories at the campfire. This is telling stories to your children. This is, telling stories to the king, telling stories to the king's son. This is the oral transmission of knowledge using a written source to make sure that the story you're telling is the correct story. You're backing it up. Any changes that you had, like, oh, that worked well, let's write this down. I think there's more happening here, more play here than just the literary record.
Here, that were really important parts of the curriculum of the ancient Near East. And so if you were going to be a scholar, a literate person, you knew them, at least at certain periods in history.
Yeah, that was the canon, the literary canon at the time before the canon as we know it now.
Exactly.
So I think the Garden of Eden story is fascinating. I also think it's fascinating to consider how it's trying to be, the priestly authors to some degree seem to be trying to supplant it, where God says, it's not good that we have this situation, and let's try this, this isn't working, and then the priestly authors say, no. God says it and then immediately recognizes, yes, this is good. So that
Exactly.
it seems to be saying, no, not that way. It's our way. Now, a question I get frequently that I've talked about on social media a lot is the relationship of Genesis 2 and 3 to Genesis 4. Because once we transition, we've got Adam and Eve in the garden, and then we transition to children of Adam and Eve. And it seems like the narrative in Genesis 4 is presupposing a fully populated earth, where Cain is like, hey, people are going to notice this, and I'm going to get in trouble, and I'm going to go over here to this city that has a name already. I'm going to find a wife. My perspective, my understanding is that Genesis 4 was probably written or initially circulated independently of Genesis 2 and 3. I don't know if people have strong feelings about which came before the other, but what can you tell us about what you think about the relationship of these two parts of ostensibly the same story?
So I'm not a scholar. I'm just giving based on my opinion and having read this a ton of times. I think I've said this before, that the three parts of the Bible that I've read the most are Genesis. The number one, the most I've ever read is the Book of Revelation. But Genesis, I've read a ton of times. I would say, yeah, all of Genesis. And there's another book that I can't think of right now. It's not Maccabees. Anyway, there's three of them that I just Psalms and Proverbs. I read those all the time, actually daily at one point. So yeah, let's go back because I lost my train of thought.
Yes, I'm totally with you, Dan, in terms of thinking that the story of Cain and Abel was the early.
There we go. So I've always thought, and I've also heard that it's an unrelated tale. That Cain and Abel is its own story because they already have people, they already have population. I think in one of the commentaries I have on the Epic of Gilgamesh, because I know there's different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, is that it is partially a retelling of that story. Just like Joseph is a retelling of the story of a different ancient story, an Egyptian story, of that happens almost the exact same way. In that book, whatever book that was that referenced the Joseph story as being a retelling of the Egyptian, I think it does. I think there is a scholar that's respected that does say that the Cain and Abel story is reflective of this earlier version of the Epic of Gilgamesh that expands on the. I forget their name now. Is it Gilgamesh and Iniku or whatever? On their relationship, and here they're brothers. They're not just really good friends. They're not just best friends. So,
Earlier one, and it doesn't presuppose a primeval world where they're the very first people, because at the very least, Cain could go off and get a wife, and it's not clear where that came from. So there are all kinds of interesting parallels between the Cain and Abel story and the Garden of Eden story. I think I have almost two pages.
The Talmud version of the story tells a slightly different telling on where that wife comes from, and I kind of wish the Christian tradition would have expanded on that, but we didn't. So
Pages. of the parallels listed that people have noticed over time.
What
So-
kinds of parallels are those?
Well, they kind of go through a very similar sequence. I should get the book out, but you start out with a problem situation. In the case of the Garden of Eden story, it's this forbidden tree. In the case of the Cain-Abel story, it's Cain getting really pissed off because God didn't pay attention to him and his offering and only focused on his brother's offering. And that's never explained in the story. It's just Cain's really mad. Right. And God basically confronts him and says, you've got a choice here. This is paraphrasing wildly, and you need to like master sin. And then the very next thing he does is take his brother out to the field and kill him. The corresponding thing in the Garden of Eden story is they eat of the fruit. And then both stories go into a dialogue with God, an interrogation that goes back and forth. And then there's an aftermath.
You have the same reference to, because part of Genesis 3 is your desire will be for your husband, which could be a sexual desire, could be a desire to dominate, but he will rule over you is also parallel, isn't it, between Genesis 3 and Genesis 4 with sin lying at the door? Yeah,
sin is lying at its door. Its desire is for you. You must rule over it, this is an actual verbal parallel. There's no way to imagine that these two texts were not written in relation to each other. And then the question becomes, so sort of which came first or how are they related? Many scholars, maybe because the Garden of Eden story is so famous and so central and that sort of thing, presuppose the Garden of Eden story was first. And those things that seem to cite it in the next chapter in Genesis 4 were a later imitation of the Garden of Eden story. I'm more tempted to think the reverse for various reasons, that first you had the Cain-Abel story that is really
Let me ask if any of the big hitters watch this part. So I have on my wish list of things that I can't afford currently. I literally can't pay one of my credit card bills right now. I have on my wish list the letters, the Hittite letters that have been translated into English, the Hittite letters that go from Hethia to Egypt. Is there, in the Hittite literature, in the stuff that's been translated, obviously, you wouldn't know the stuff that hasn't been translated, are there any parallels to the Garden of Eden? Is there any... Because I understand there being parallels to the Garden of Eden, any area, Samaria, Babylonia, any of that kind of stuff, it makes sense. You know what I mean? But on the higher regions, in the regions away from the Euphrates and the Tigris, are there still stories of a Garden of Eden type place? That's what I'd be interested in. I love reading this kind of ancient material. So, if you even want to point me to a translation that's now available, I'll gladly put it on my wish list.
Kind of an implicit story that's providing some background to a neighboring people of the authors, the Kenites, and that then the person who wrote...
Is it the Amarian letters?
Wrote the larger non-priestly primeval history, this pre-exilic primeval history, sort of took that Cain-Abel story as a model for what they did in the Garden of Eden story, and they sort of extended it backward. That's what I think makes more sense.
Yeah,
I've never heard that theory before. That's kind of cool. Like I said, the one that I read and the one that I kind of understood was that it was a parallel between the Epic of Gilgamesh story and an earlier Epic of Gilgamesh story and Cain and Abel.
I've one of the things that I found really interesting, I was saying this to Dan earlier before we had you with us on the call, is that I liked that the subtitle of your book, The Formation of Genesis 1 through 11, is Biblical and Other Precursors. And I said to Dan, wait, the Bible is the precursor to the Bible? And he was like, yeah, it was. And that's kind of what we're talking about, is like the Bible continually precursing itself.
Yes.
One of the things that's really hard to explain to people is when they come to you and they say that, well, Judaism or Catholicism or Christianity or the Bible is the oldest religion. And they have this weird worldview where the Bible existed first and then everything else kind of stems out from it. And they will reject a worldview that has anything that predates the Bible. I don't see how that's possible, considering we have records of wedge writing. You know, we have Phoenician script. Like I don't understand how these people can think that.
Exactly. That the Bible, when you get inside it more, turns out to be this complex, sometimes conflictual dialogue between different perspectives.
You know, the way that I envision the Bible, and I've envisioned this for a long time, is like it's a cipher, and then like it's spinning, and like there's different portions and pages, and it's just like spinning, and you got different meaning, and different meaning comes out of it, and this process hasn't stopped. Even today, you're still spinning the wheel, and you're still different pages are sliding into other pages, and you're getting this new context.
That are very opposed to each other, which for me kind of becomes an interesting model. Many people, when they read the Bible, just presuppose, oh, I'm supposed to just agree with everything in it and just, organize my whole life around it. But the Bible itself models a process of argument and wrestling and that sort of thing. That's how this text got put together.
And that's the understanding that I get. And it's not just the church fathers, it's not just the rabbinical writings. Everything I've read that has stuck with me on the Bible, that has inspired me to be a better person, has said, this is about arguing with it. This is about struggling with it. This is not about simply accepting it just because it says it. It's contextualizing it. It's, it's really important to wrestle with these words.
Do you think that the people who originally read these texts, the people for whom these texts were written, the contemporaneous to the time of the writing, do you think that they understood them in that way, as being explorations of ideas as opposed to literal truths?
Well, I think they had a different idea of literal truth than we do. The way they would write history would not be the way most of us would try to write a good quality history now. They were more comfortable, say reconstructing what they thought Abraham must have said because of what they believe. And they would think, okay, then that's what he said. Is what I believe would be what he would say. And that's what you do. We wouldn't do that now. But I think, for example, back to the example we were talking about before of the priestly creation story being written to contradict the Garden of Eden story and replace it. I think the people who wrote that priestly creation story believed that what they were writing was correct and that the Garden of Eden story was incorrect. I do think that's one reason why they wrote it the way they did and didn't just sort of add some things around the edges of the Garden of Eden story and leave it at that. They really felt like they believed in it. And in a sense, I think, yes, they both believed that what they were writing had happened, but they were as equally committed to what it meant about God, what it meant about the Sabbath.
That's something I'd have to wrestle with. That the writers thought it was literal. I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way. That the writers thought that everything they were writing was literal. That's the way it actually absolutely happened. I think they were doing something more clever than that. I don't think they were just compiling different histories. I think they were, and like I said, I don't think they were just arguing against each other. I think they were arguing against the other beliefs in the surrounding cultures. And I don't think it was. Even for the writers, I don't think it was simply literal. I think there's a lot more going on there.
Because that's the crowning aspect of the 7-day creation account and that sort of thing. So they believed in it. But then, the texts travel over time and it turns out that both of these texts persist as important, that the priestly account doesn't succeed in replacing the non-priestly material. And so, 150 years later, communities say, we're not going to let either one of these go. And so they just put them together.
No.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was reading through,
so I keep on hearing in a lot of these, and not just from these guys, but from newer apologists, the communal aspect of agreeing to the words, the church, the church itself, the synagogue itself, the community itself. The bishops and the leaders are the ones in charge. The bishops and the leaders are the ones in charge. The priest and the pharaoh or the king or the emperor, those are the ones who are in charge. The head king for most of these communities is the is the king of the nation, is also the religious leader. So he gets to decide what survives and what doesn't survive. And I think about Atan, I think it's Atan is his name, in Egypt, where the next ruler just simply wiped him out. There's not going to be a monotheistic God here. So I think we're giving too much power to the people back then. I don't think they had that much say or that much sway over what the leader did. I think the great leader, the great man theory stands.
This part of Genesis, and I read the account of the flood, and then I got to the Tower of Babel, and I went, oh yeah, because if everyone's descended from the same family, we have a language problem. How do we explain why there are so many languages? And suddenly there's a reason why we need to explain why there's all of these languages. And so it made sudden sense to me. Like, there's a certain sense that can be found in just going like, oh wait, some smart ass just was like, okay, well, if we all descended from Noah, why are those guys speaking a different language and those guys a different language or something like that? It just seems like a lot of these, there are questions that get answered by the next thing or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And really back to where we started this conversation about what is a primeval history. A primeval history is a story about how these aspects of the audience's reality came to be. It's all of that. And this actually kind of relates to something I think many people haven't realized enough reading these chapters, which is they sometimes will talk about a creation story, fair enough, in a way. And then they'll distinguish a creation story like the Garden of Eden or the Genesis 1 7-day account, which we've been talking about so far, from the stories that come after, as if they're somehow different stories. But for the ancients, the social reality that they lived in was as much a part of their world as the natural, what we call our like natural scientific reality. They didn't separate a sort of natural world from a social world. So the whole primeval history, all the way up to the Tower of Babel story that you were just talking about, Dan, is in a sense a creation story. It's all an origin story about the world they live in, including multiple languages, including, farming and childbirth and Sabbath and wine and sex and all this sort of thing. It's all bound up together, and that's all part of this origin story, which is Genesis 1 to 11.
Damn. Oh, that's gonna get it copyrighted. All right, so far this has been great. I love everything this guy's saying. I think he's a great guest. I think he's very well educated on this stuff. Mind you, I've literally have said almost all the exact same things on this channel for the last 7 years. But I don't have a PhD behind my name, and I don't have a bunch of papers that are academically whatever. I can't think of the word right now. I love everything this guy's saying so far.
Most fun 3 passages of scripture in the Hebrew Bible, namely the B'nai Elohim story in Genesis 6. But before I move on to that, I wanted to ask you real quick, do you think there's anything to the theory that there was a liturgical function for these creation accounts that they...
I don't remember what he said here. But I think there is a liturgical function to these stories. I think there is. Maybe not originally, but I do think they developed into that. I do think there's a reason why the priest wrote their version. And it would be weird for the priest to write something that doesn't have at least some kind of liturgical aspect to it.
Were part of New Year's festivals, that they were part of some kind of liturgy in a temple or anything like that.
So
I think he's kind of attacking Jordan Peterson there, but we'll see.
I think that there's a good case to be made for a liturgical function for some of the non-biblical precursor texts from Mesopotamia. For example, the Enuma Elish has certain connections into the Akitu New Year's festival in Babylon. And that's part of why the authors of this text, who were dealing with the trauma of Babylonian destruction of their city and temple and exile, wanted to write their counter to this important text in Babylonia. But I don't think that's the primary context for these texts in Genesis 1 to 11. As you probably know, Dan, I really do think for most of the texts in the Bible, whatever some of their genres are that imitate some other things, they were mainly meant for use in ancient education in schools to be memorized.
I'm going to say this. I disagree with him there. That's the first place I've disagreed with him. I think a lot of this is liturgical. I definitely think Psalms and Proverbs are liturgical. I definitely think most of the New Testament is liturgical. So, yeah, we don't disagree.
So that you could sort of educate the next generation in that literate minority. And so that's what I think these texts are doing.
Okay. Which now brings us, we're going to talk a little bit. I think we can summarize some of the Toledot, the genealogical material a little bit later. But when we get to Genesis 6, we have the sons of God.
I hope we get some of the genealogical stuff before my episode ends, because I want to see what their take on what I argued against with Gavin Ortlund.
God, who noticed that they really like the cut of the jib of the daughters of humanity, and come down and take wives and have children with them. And the text says there were Nephilim on the earth in that day and after. And this seems to me to be a story that seems inserted at the beginning of the story of the flood to give a more plausible rationale for the destruction of all the earth. Because once we actually get to God making a decision to destroy the earth, all it says is, he looked around, there was violence everywhere, and so he decides to destroy the earth. What can you tell us about precursors to Genesis 6, the role of this story in the beginning of the flood narrative?
Yeah, well, this is one of my favorite texts too, actually.
I would love to have a coffee with this guy, but a coffee where we're having a conversation, not just a coffee where we're talking about this kind of stuff.
Actually, it's such an interesting. I mean, it's just these little corners of the Bible where you kind of go, "Oh man, I can't believe this is here. Why didn't anybody tell me about this?" I guess now that it's juxtaposed with the flood, which, as you say, starts with God seeing that the evil of humanity is just thoroughgoing and that sort of thing, and being sorry God made them. Since this story comes right before that, it's been tempting for many interpreters to say, "Okay, well, there must be something wrong with these divine human marriages." The puzzle is that humans do absolutely nothing wrong in the story.
Right. Yeah.
The only beings that do anything are the sons of God, who take the humans for wives and then have giant children of them. And so,
I always liked the idea that they were demigods, and that those are the ancient gods and goddesses of the other cultures. I always thought that was a great explanation.
And the agency of these human women wouldn't matter anyway. This is not their will when it comes to marriage is pretty irrelevant in the text. They are taken, not
in this text. They are taken. There's evidence that women had agency within marriage in ancient Israel, but that's certainly not highlighted here. It's just the sons of God doing it. And God, this is another place where I think we can overread it. God does not ever say they did something wrong. God just says, my spirit can't abide in these humans, and I will set a lifetime limit of 120 years. And then it goes on to say, and then giants were in the land at the time, and this was the time of the warriors of old who were the men of the name. And I mean, one thing I think we just have to remember, Dan, here is that 120-year lifespan within the world of the ancient Levant was huge. They could barely conceptualize anyone living that long. That was like the absolute outside limit. Interestingly, we find the exact same lifetime limit mentioned in Mesopotamian wisdom texts that are preserved in Syria, that are talking about the sort of absolute limit of human life. So this is something people are talking about. It's another place where Genesis is based on some precursors of some kind. Maybe not that particular text, but that kind of idea is in circulation.
Now, what about the idea of just original thought? How sometimes people get, and this has happened with me, and I always bring up ultimate reality, but there's other stuff that, me and a buddy of mine back when we were in college thought, if we got people playing video games, and they were playing video games with women in bikinis, and it was like live, and the word stream didn't exist, so it was just like you could see them playing, and they were like, there's no nudity, no cussing, no anything, just simply having beautiful women playing video games with the guys who are on the other end. And this is back in the days of LAN parties and modems and that kind of thing. Like, we'd be rich, and it's not as if we are the founders of Twitch, but that is an idea that multiple people had at that time. So does it have to be influenced in that way, or it could just be like, hey, this is something people are thinking about, and this is the conclusion based on the material available that people are coming to?
But where I'm going with this is, in the ancient world, we see myths around this in Hittite literature, in ancient Greek literature, that when the gods mate with humans, the resulting offspring have the characteristics of both. And that can mean usually that they're big, because gods are big. I mean, you've got to remember that gods are really huge in the ancient world. They're also beautiful. Gods are beautiful. If there's a male, they're strong. They're incredibly strong, superhumanly strong. And the other thing that humans can get from being mixed divine
Unless you're Hephaestus.
human parentage is they can become immortal. And so what seems to be an issue in this story is very similar to the Garden of Eden story, where God will not abide humans having divine immortality. And this act by the sons of God threatens that. And so God doesn't say, oh, bad you did this or whatever. God just says, okay, well, we're going to have to just put a circuit breaker on the lifespan of the offspring. And so they're going to be big and they're going to be strong. And that's part of why we hear about giants and about warriors of old. They're these divine human offspring. But they're not going to be immortal. But they'll have but they're also, this is a subtle detail, is they're going to be men of the name, which is, I don't know how it's translated in many common translations, but the idea here is the ancients were well aware we all die. And the question becomes, well, okay, so what comes after? There was no concept of afterlife in this culture. So to some extent, it would be your kids. You'd have kids, and that would be your immortality. And that in the Garden of Eden actually talks a lot about that at the end. So that's one form of living on, even though you will certainly die. But another main way that you had immortality in the ancient world was fame. And so this text says, I'm setting a 120-year limit. It's a great big limit, actually, for divine human offspring. But they're gonna be famous. They're gonna be the giants that you know from other legends. We hear about them in the book of Joshua and so on. They were in the land of Canaan when the Israelites come. Right. Or the warriors of old, who are the men of name, like the giant famous warriors of David. These are people who are part of the broader setting of the audience.
And again, the explanation that I've always liked is that these are the gods and goddesses and the demigods of other cultures and the heroes of other cultures, even the ones that are unknown. It's a way to explain it away, which I think me and him might slightly disagree on that there.
So they can, oh yeah, we know about those guys, and they're a testimony to sort of the truth of the story. So anyway, where I'm going with this is it's a take on the story that really doesn't involve any wrongdoing, really. It's just kind of humans kind of struggling against this border of immortality. But then you have this real disjunction that happens where all of a sudden after this, where humans do nothing wrong, if anything, the women are raped, to God sees that the evil of humans is just complete and total. And you kind of go, what? Where did this occur? And I don't find it in this Genesis 6 story. Maybe you'd find it in the Cain and Abel story, though it's just one guy and then his son Lamech. The place where many people have tried to find that evilness, that's incorrigible evilness, is in the Garden of Eden story. And I think that's a lot of why people see original sin and that sort of thing in the Garden of Eden story, where it's just a story of two kids growing up in many ways. So where I'm going with this is really to say, I really think what we're looking at right there between this real...
I disagree with this understanding on original sin as well, but of course I am influenced by the church fathers and by the understanding of the Catholic Church. So
really interesting,
meaning the Catechism,
ancient story about the origins of giants and famous warriors, and the flood narrative, which is talking about the evil of humanity, is kind of a scene between an earlier layer of that origin story, which had no flood, and a later layer that was written at a very different time with very different precursors that has a different vision of what humanity's about and what God's about too. You have a very different sort of flavor to the flood story that starts right then.
And this is something that you bring up in your book, but when we get into Noah's life, it seems like Noah's claim to fame is viticulture. Yeah. And we have these references to the people who are around, and it's like, oh, they're the ones who dwell in tents, and they're the ones who make these instruments and tools and everything. It's like, well, it doesn't matter what they did if they're about to all be destroyed in the flood. The way the story is told, it doesn't seem to be anticipating the destruction of all humanity, and then all of a sudden we get the flood. So,
and that's an interesting point. I don't know, it was the third or fourth time I read through the story completely, not, it's just getting a certain way through and stopping. But when I read it through completely, you have the origin, and this is not just here. There are similar origin tales in other cultures of the woodworker, the plumber, the dentist, the hunter, the whatever, and you have that set, but then they're all wiped out. So it doesn't connect well to the flood unless you're saying they somehow also survived. So it does feel like it's either a different story or a different layer or an insert meant to connect another aspect that maybe was lost or something like that, or that they didn't like and they didn't want to include. A transition, if you will.
In your book, you talk about how it seems that the flood is a later insertion into this narrative. Can you expand a little bit on the flood narrative, how it's coming in and interrupting things?
Sure, I can. I mean, you touched on the first major indicator, which is just that chapter 4 of Genesis, when it's talking about the descendants of Cain, they build cities, they found music and pasturing herds and building tents, and there's this whole building of culture and this sort of thing. And then you have this story we were just talking about in Genesis 6, where there are a bunch of giants and warriors, which the audience is supposed to know about and think this story would explain. And then suddenly a flood comes and wipes everybody out. And so it's unclear kind of how these stories work, if that's actually the case. Now, there is an ancient Mesopotamian story of the flood, Atrahasis, and in an adoption of that story into the Gilgamesh epic that we were talking about earlier, that solved this problem by actually having all the artisans and stuff come on the ark with the flood hero. So it's a big party. Everybody's on the boat together. And so you can explain it that way. But the way the Genesis flood story goes, there's only Noah, his sons, and their wives on the ark. That's it. So there's a real kind of narrative problem there. Some ancient Jewish rabbinic interpreters solved this problem partly by imagining that one of the major giants that was born of the union of the gods and women held on to the outside of the ark during the flood. And that's how he made it long enough.
I thought you were going to say that his nose stayed just above water level. That's so tall.
I like that. Maybe that's a rabbinic tradition I haven't uncovered yet.
I think there's the snorkel theory of.
But anyway, early readers saw that there was this.
And for those watching, I do recommend you go get the art scroll, get the Shamash, or Shamash, get some rabbinical commentaries, and get the Talmudic stuff on this as well, and you'll see very different understandings and different interplays. The story is not as concrete as we like to make it. There's a lot of play. There's a lot of malleability. There's a lot of interesting and interplay going on with different cultures and different understandings. Mind you, a lot of the rabbinical commentary is medieval, so that's not actually going back to that original time, but it just shows you that there's more understandings than just the literal Protestant one.
This issue, and they had to try to explain it. I think another thing that kind of is striking, I think you mentioned, Dan, that Noah's main claim to fame seems to be that he founded viticulture, the making of wine, which in ancient Israel was like, this is a big deal. People in the ancient world drank fermented beverages. It was one way to have safe drinking water because the alcohol would automatically take care of bacteria. And of course, they'd also get a little buzz from it, or more than a little buzz in Noah's case. So
also the boiling.
Anyway, so Noah's name is explained in terms of his founding of viticulture, but we don't get to hear about him doing that until after the flood story, where he's kind of reintroduced to us as he's a man of the arable ground, Ish Ha'adamah. And then we hear about, okay, what did he do with the ground? He planted vines, and then he got drunk on the fruit from it. I mean, what did he know? He's the first.
And also, there's people after there's the different cultures. The way culture develops after the flood, also pre-flood and after flood. These two kind of stop gaps. Like I said, everything that I've read up till now, before watching this, these are two completely different stories, two completely different tells. The post-flood narrative is one take on reality. The pre-flood narrative is a different take on reality because you're setting up different things and it just gets stopgapped with the flood. And you get a totally new story. It's like wiping out the previous story. But you don't want to lose the previous story because it's still relevant. And in the previous story, there's sections that are from other versions. And so it just makes sense that it's a polemic. It really, really, really does.
Human to do it. So he's just like drinks a whole lot of it, and he's flat out drunk and gets naked. And there's a whole story that comes from that. So that's one Noah. But then there's this flood hero Noah that's like this. It has a very different character to him. And I think I speak of sort of the two Noahs. The Noah, the original Noah, who founds viticulture and has this drama with his sons, and the flood hero Noah, which is what some later authors make of that figure as they make him into the flood hero, using the Mesopotamian stories as their model.
And now when we get to the flood, we have you talked about two different strands, the priestly and the non-P or J strand. And we see two beginnings, two middles, and two ends to the flood story kind of woven together, don't we?
We do. I mean, this is actually relatively rare throughout the Torah to find two stories parallel to each other that are so tightly interwoven, like episode by episode. In most cases, it's more like the two creation stories we were just talking about, where you have a complete priestly text and then a complete non-priestly text, and they're not mixed together. But, you can't really pull that off with a flood story. If you told one flood story and then God at the end said, I'm never sending another flood, and then you told the other flood story, it would begin to look like the divine abuse cycle, I think. So
they get away with it once, but we already took care of that with the creation.
Yeah. But it's remarkable that they preserved so much of these stories. Now, many scholars have pointed out in the last decade or two, there are some gaps at points where it seems like, for example, the J or non-P story doesn't have an account of Noah receiving instructions to build the ark and then building it. That's only in the priestly strand. But again, I just think for the authors who were combining these, they weren't idiots. They wanted to produce a reliable, readable narrative. So you can't have them building two arcs according to two different designs and that sort of thing. Yeah. So there were places where they had to edit some, but still, even with all that, when you take apart all the doublets that occur across these chapters, you end up with remarkably continuous, not completely continuous, but remarkably continuous stories that episode by episode, it adds up to about 10 different parallels. They all add up to the flood story, and they even have completely different chronologies that don't match up with each other.
Yeah. I think that's one of the exciting places where we can kind of see the seams of these things being worked together. The sale of Joseph into Egypt is another one that I've thought is fascinating because you can pull them apart and get two full narratives. I've talked before about Noah and his sons, and you talk a bit in the book about how it seems that Ham is a late addition here. There are some textual things going on here, but one of the popular theories is that of what exactly went wrong. And we don't have to get too deep into this, but do you favor a sexual sin having been committed, or is this really as simple as seeing the father naked and basically spreading his shame rather than protecting his honor? What do you think the nature of the indiscretion there is?
I think in terms of the original text, it's pretty clear that it's the latter option you mentioned, Dan, that there was a strong belief in the ancient world that I think in our contemporary world we're remarkably out of touch with, but it's the idea that children owed their parents loyalty and honor. It's the sort of obey your parents kind of thing, but it was very deeply ingrained. A basic idea that you really owed the older generation respect. And there's even a text in Ugarit, which is a city north of ancient Judah and Israel, that talks about the duty of the child to take care of their father when he's drunk. That if your parent gets vulnerable, because they've had a few too many, your job as the child is to preserve their honor and take care of them. And it is that which actually the original son in that story of Noah and his son is probably Canaan. That's what Canaan fails to do, is he both sees his father's nakedness, and then perhaps most importantly, he goes out and tells his brothers about it.
And I think that's another aspect that they haven't really mentioned. I'm sure they're hit on it. If not today, then at some other point. But they're also representing cultures. So Canaan's representing Canaan. Each one of these sons are in daughters to that point, are representing different cultures and different identities. So they're not just representing the Jewish ancestry, they're representing kind of everybody and everything. So, if you had a story, and I've said this in some other video, if you had a story where America, Canada, and Mexico were hanging out and they were kind of picking on Australia or something like that, or they're picking on Europe, and Australia comes in and England's there and everyone's there. And these characters are representing these cultures, and so they act in a kind of typical, stereotypical, maybe even you might want to call it racist way, because they're trying to identify the best and worst parts of each thing. And if you're American, you're going to have America have all the good traits, and you're going to have, you're going to have Cain or whoever else have all the bad traits, So it depends on who you want to denigrate and who you want to lift up. So yeah, Ishmael and Israel, what I mean? That kind of thing.
So he just radically compromises that idea of filial duty. And so, a hungover Noah wakes up, realizes what his youngest son has done to him, and curses Canaan to eternal slavery, while blessing Shem, which in Hebrew means name. So we're back to the name theme we were talking about earlier. Yeah. Blesses Shem and his brother Japheth.
And I'm not sure which commentary it is. I know I've seen several different charts showing which name matches which culture and all that kind of thing.
So for me, that's what I think the original story was about. But there's some texts later in Leviticus that talk about the sort of sexual promiscuity of Canaanites and that kind of thing that have verbal resonances with the story we're talking about. And I think over time in tradition, early Jewish tradition and later, the kind of sexual connotations of that got kind of merged into this story. And of course, the nakedness too played a role in that. But the story says nothing whatsoever of anything that the son has done to Noah, other than see his nakedness and talk with his brothers about it.
And we're going to get the name theme coming up again at the end of the primeval history, when we have folks who are building this tower. The Tower of Babel. In order to, it says it's going to touch the heavens, but the main thing is they're going to make a name for themselves. And again, we have God looking down, stroking their beards, saying, not too happy about this. Let's go down and frustrate this. Now, in your book, you talk about the Tower of Etemenanki, which was constructed much earlier in near Babylon, was not totally destroyed, but fell into disrepair and took decades, like 80 some years for...
Almost everything they've referenced, I think maybe everything they've referenced except for one thing, I have reference for in my mind, and I'm like I said, I'm not a scholar, so I've definitely read all this stuff before.
A project to finally kind of repair things. And so it seems to me like maybe this is kind of these folks thumbing their nose at the Assyrians for leaving this unfinished tower, not managing to get it finished for a while. Can you talk a little bit about the precursor for the story of the Tower of Babel? Is this a reflection of the Tower of Etemenanki?
I do think it is. Yes, I think that seems clear. And then the question becomes sort of how is it interacting with that tower, and at what point? We all know this tower is the Tower of Babylon, I think, but it was located in Babylon. But there were significant periods of time when Babylon was actually ruled by an empire located a bit north of Babylon in what we now know as northern Iraq, but was ancient Assyria. And
seriously, like I know this. Like I know this. Hold on. Which one is it? Where are you? I'm going to let him keep talking, but I'm going to look for this because like, I know this word for word.
And the Assyrian empires were incredibly powerful. They actually totally destroyed the Babylonian, sort of their southern neighbor, a couple of times. And in the wake of one of those destructions, the Assyrians got involved in what was really the first big renovation project, to go back to what you were talking
Maybe
about,
in the
Dan,
commentary here.
where they actually, for the first time, cover the tower with ceramic outside
No,
things
this is
that
Stephanie
are
David.
like they're fired porcelain and stuff. And it's striking to me that the aspects of the story, it's very detailed
Okay,
actually in its description
Sanders.
of the construction, correspond a lot more in some ways to this Assyrian restoration of the Babylonian tower than they do to like the state of the tower during the
Marion
Babylonian
Gallery
exile.
Kovacs.
It seems to be and also one other thing is, later on when the Babylonians destroy
Albert T.
Jerusalem,
Clay.
burn its temple, kill most of its people, deport most of the rest of them into largely salinated, abandoned parts of Babylon to
L.W.
finish their
King.
lives far from their homeland. In the wake of that, most of the people who went through that really had a pretty low view of the Babylonians. And we have various oracles in the books of Jeremiah and Isaiah and elsewhere that really proclaim absolute destruction on the Babylonians. Or Psalm 137 says, "Happy are those who bash the babies of Babylon heads against a rock." This is the attitude toward Babylon that comes in the wake of the exile. Mm-hmm. Whatever is going on in the Tower of Babel story, it's not that. They're not. Yeah. Humans come into conflict with God in a way without even knowing it. Really, God just gets worried about their collective power. But it's not like they're bad or evil.
You know what's in your cheap protein powder? Well, here to tell us is all-natural fitness athlete Paul Sklar.
All right, let's see what.
And so I think back to your question about how is it related to this tower? I think it's one of the most famous architectural wonders of the ancient world. And the authors of this text seem to know some pretty detailed stuff about it. And so they use it as a jumping off point for telling a story about the spread of humanity in the wake of the flood. Because you got to spread over the whole earth now. And how you got the linguistic diversity, different languages that we were talking earlier about. So,
I wonder how large the earth was when they were writing this. What they know about Russia, what they know about Japan, how big was the world? I'm assuming they knew the Mediterranean. Now, in the Babylonian area, maybe they know that area. Doubt they would know all of Africa.
So that's their jumping off point, their knowledge of this amazing tower.
And that gives us the 70 nations of the earth, and now the table is set to introduce our hero Abraham. It sounds like our main narrative arcs in the primeval history are kind
They didn't do the genealogy thing, which I really wanted them to do.
of presenting humanity as just trying to do their best, where the deity is kind of like a foil, is the antagonist in the story that is making sure that they don't breach those boundaries between humanity and divinity. And at the same time, though, we're also working a lot of etiologies, a lot of origin stories for the world as we know it, whether that is this unfinished tower that those losers over there were trying to build, or why man, I really hate snakes, or all the different aspects of human civilization as they understood it. Not all the different, but several of the different aspects are represented etiologically in these stories. If you had to kind of sum up what the authors of the primeval history are getting at, what would you say is kind of the point? What would you say they want their listenership to come away with?
If the Bible were a podcast, what would they?
That's you really threw me a tough one there off the bat.
Give us the elevator pitch. Give us the 25 words.
I'm going to sound very Catholic. They want to show that God is the creator and master of the universe, that all the other gods and goddesses are submit to him, or they are not true gods and goddesses. And all other gods and goddesses are simply creations. They are not the uncreated God. That God is the master of all. God knows everyone's hopes and desires. All tragedies are controlled by God. There's no one good or one evil that's outside of God's control. So God controls everything, good and evil. There's no other power. There's no power equal to God. Either it's by God's active will or submissive will that things are. They want the people to be uniquely Jewish or Israelic. They want to wash out or laundry out all the influence from Babylon and Assyria and while at the same time purifying their ideas, refining their ideas to make them more Jewish, make them more Israelic. And they're trying to preserve an identity that they think is lost. So they're trying to revive an identity that they don't know anymore. And it's why their version of their culture overrides the remnant that remains that they find still in Israel. Because they've been themselves the whole time, so they don't have a reason to do this, while the people who are in exile lost their identity briefly, or maybe not so briefly. And this is a way of redefining your own culture by saying what your culture is not. That's my opinion. Anyway, let's see what this guy says.
Or less.
Yeah. Well, I would just say, I was talking earlier about how these biblical texts were forged amidst trauma. And I actually think that was true. That was true definitely for the priestly material. Almost all my colleagues, including my wonderful colleague Leanne Feldman, would agree with me in defining the priestly narrative and placing it more or less in that period, I think. But even the non-priestly strand that I was talking about, when you had the flood is really talking about catastrophe and about God dealing with human evil and then somehow finding a way to cope with it. Like saying, okay, I sent one flood, but I realize they're evil, but I'm not going to do that ever again. And one of the things I don't know if we talked about this at the beginning of the podcast, but one of the books I did write for a broader audience had to do with trauma studies and the forging of the Bible amidst trauma. And so that's some of where I've been coming from in this talk. But
holy resilience.
Exactly. And I do think that, a lot of the big message that people are supposed to get out of both of these strands is that God can take whatever humanity can throw at God. That it was a struggle, not easy. There's some back and forth, but God has dealt with a lot, and the world we now have is a result of God's kind of having to come to terms with a humanity that doesn't fully live up to the ideal God originally envisioned. That's more than 25 words, but that's my best.
It's great. One of the things that I want to talk to you about is to flip that on its head and talk about it from the opposite perspective of God sort of being a disappointment to humanity. But we're going to, if we get to that, it will be in the patrons only segment because we have run out of time. So
all right, that's it. All right, let me go back to my live screen. So for some reason, today's audience was a little bit smaller than it has been for the last few months. I'm not sure why. But I would like to, again, acknowledge that I did make a mistake in my words yesterday. I should have said Ahab and Ayaz. And I do know that one of my viewers did give me a stronger answer. Let me look that up real quick. Let's see. Dr. Kip Davis said that he believes that it's Abed Hepa is the first recorded king of Jerusalem we know of from the Armenian letters. So there you go. All right. Thank you all. I hope you all have a great night. For those of you who are concerned or who were turned off by the fact that yesterday I was getting so upset at Dr. Gavin Ortlund, understand, I affirm the biblical canon. I affirm that Adam and Eve are real. I affirm that there was a fall. I affirm original sin. But just like the popes, just like the writings I've read from the popes, the story doesn't have to be completely literal. It can be a polemic. It can be, it can contain hyperbole and example, and it can be trying to tell something different than just a literal event. And you got to remember that Adam and Eve are not the name of whoever these people were. They might not have even had names as far as we know. Maybe the whole thing of being ensouled is having a name. Maybe having a name is that big leap forward into consciousness. We don't know. And we shouldn't try to speculate beyond what the limits of the text are. The text is trying to tell us a specific story, and that story is super important, not just to theology, but to our own identities and to who we are. Anyway, with that, peace, subscribe, like. I do have a Patreon. Please support me there, and have a great night.
Always do it on my own, so I gotta get through it. And the only thing I know is to love what I'm doing. Never give up, never slow, till I finally prove it. Never listen to the no's, I just wanna keep moving. Keep my head up when I act, head up, that's a fact. Never looking back, I'ma keep myself on track. Keep my head up, staying strong, always moving on. Feel I don't belong, tell my thoughts to move along. Push myself to be the best, die with no regrets. Live with every breath, see my message start to spread. And I had so many dreams, then you hit your teens. Life ain't really what it seems, try to find out what it means. Always do it on my own, so I gotta get through it. And the only thing I know is to love what I'm doing. Never give up, never slow, till I finally prove it. Never listen to the no's, I just wanna keep moving. Yeah, I put out all this art, it's my only medicine. Yeah, everything I do, I'm just being genuine. Yeah, I'm sick of being screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah. I'm grateful, oh yeah, able, oh yeah, I'm stable, oh yeah, no label, oh yeah, you know me.